The horrors of World War II. Our objective in this module is to determine what made World War II unique. Now, it is certainly true that all world wars are hell, but World War II was catastrophic. What made it so catastrophic? So unprecedentedly destructive and so horrific that survivors were determined to bring about a different world and to ensure that this catastrophe would never happen again. So World War II didn't happen in a vacuum. In fact, many historians tend to view World War II as the second chapter of Europe's Civil War. In other words, there was a fundamental connection between World War I and World War II. And in a way, the unresolved business of Versailles was resolved and brought to culmination by World War II. So when we're looking at World War II from a deeper historical lens, one of the things that we can see is that some of the fundamental flaws in the world system, these fissures grew more intense, making this conflict in one way or another inevitable. So what was the nature of this world that propagated World War II? Well, first of all, it was a world dominated by the European great powers, what they called themselves the great powers. What this meant is that most people in the world, most non-Western people, their lives, their livelihoods, were really determined by policies that were set far away in European cities. It was also a world in which people's views about race and evolution were very prominently expressed, particularly in terms of various fascist theories that in a way justified genocide as somehow natural, a process of evolution. But to a lesser degree, we tend to forget this, also imprinted in European colonialism that essentially established, apartheid states with separate rules for whites and non-whites, and which resorted to the euphemism of colonial pacification when it came to applying violence to keep non-Western people in these systems of exploitation against their will. World War II was also a product of the Great Depression. Black Tuesday had ultimately brought into being these radical regimes, democracies, collapsed throughout most of the world. And the belligerents, the architects of World War II, were mostly fascist regimes that were brought into power by the Great Depression. And in many cases, their dreams for empire, their wars, were in part trying to deal with resolving the problems of the Great Depression in terms of seizing territory, bread, and resources necessary for economic development. World War II was also a sibling of Versailles. Versailles had had this mandate of the people to never allow another world war to happen. And no sooner was the ink dry, and even its own architects recognized that the treaty was a lamentable mistake that would drive Germany in particular, but also anger Japan, drive them out of the liberal international order, make them hostile to it, and essentially sow the seeds of the next war. There were several features that made World War II unique. One was its global scope. I mean, it's not called a World War for nothing, but World War II was much more global than World War I had been, which certainly did have a Pacific theater and certainly mobilized colonial troops to fight in Europe. But the fighting was geographically quite constrained. I mean, most of the combat took place in a narrow band in Belgium, and France. And World War II, on the other hand, the fighting was much more expansive, and the Pacific theater was a major theater of war, not just kind of a minor theater where Japan was cleaning up on German colonies. So, in other words, the radius of World War II, its destructive effect, its disruptive wake was a lot more broadly radiated across the globe. Another thing that made World War II unique is what historians call total war mobilization. In fighting an industrial war and keeping these technological armies in the field and fueled and fed, it really required states to dramatically expand the scope of their control over their citizen workers, the national resources, and private corporations to essentially reorient the economy towards armaments production and supporting the armies in the field. So, for Canadians, children and women on the home front, older workers that weren't being shipped overseas, in a way they were soldiers outside of uniform, but just as essential in terms of logistics in supplying the armies in the field. So this meant that the experience of war was no longer limited to the soldiers fighting on some battlefield in the 16th century. Essentially the war was a societal-wide experience. And even if you weren't being shipped to some strange environment like Papua New Guinea or the deserts of Libya, you too were taking part in this experience of World War II that basically was dominating lives all across the globe. A third feature that made World War II unique was essentially the internal combustion engine. In particular, airplanes and tanks meant that the striking power and geographic range of armies was dramatically extended versus the First World War. Another important feature was how, in various ways, these weapons enabled the war to be brought hundreds of miles from the front lines to civilian rear areas. So by inventing doctrines like strategic warfare and having bombers and targeting enemy industrial centers and killing thousands and thousands of civilians, in a sense there was a blurring between combatants. There was combatants in uniform, there were combatants outside uniform, and many children in air raid shelters were experiencing the horrors of war as soldiers in the front in World War I, the trenches, had experienced it. The final feature, which was very important in terms of really shaping World War II and also its destructive effect, is that the architects of World War II were fascist states, and they were driven by these very radical ideological doctrines, not just that might made right, but in a way that warfare between states, Hitler looked at this as, in a sense, a manifestation of a deeper drive of races for land and resources. So he defined everything in terms of race. And having these kind of social Darwinistic ideas embedded in diplomacy and warcraft meant that the Axis powers, particularly in their early victories when they conquered a lot of territory and brought hundreds of millions of Allied civilians under their rule, the way that they looked at enemy civilians was not only that they were conquered peoples that would have to obey their law and their authority, but in a way that they were undesirable, that their land should be appropriated, and even the idea of ethnic cleansing and extermination was implicit in various ways in their imperial strategies, in their way of waging war. So this had the obvious consequence that civilians were not just caught in the crossfire, but that civilians were actually deliberately targeted for abuse, They were targeted by armies, and they were even, targeted for ethnic cleansing. Another important way to look at World War II, I think, is in terms of geography and history. In a way, when we say the word World War II, we mean not only this global conflict, but also how these kind of three separate wars converged into one single conflict. So, in a sense, the origins of World War II go back to the Versailles Treaty and the Paris conferences, and the sense among Germans, Italians, and Japan that they weren't treated fairly, and that made them very hostile to the liberal international system, the League of Nations, that the Entente powers established in the wake of World War I. They were not only hostile to the Versailles system, but from the very beginning in 1919, they were so hostile to it, they were conspiring against it in various ways. Whether it was trying to get around armaments limitations, whether it was to get back lost territory, whether it was to attack innocent neighbors, brutalize their civilians, steal their resources. In many ways, the origins of World War II go way before Hitler's invasion in Poland in 1939. Just 3 days after Hitler was appointed chancellor, he was already talking to his generals about future wars to redraw Germany's boundaries. So during the 1930s and the Great Depression, the Axis states were weak. They were definitely weaker than the Entente powers, and they used primarily, bluffing and diplomacy to try to strengthen their case and to seize land in various ways, to test the limits of Allied resolve. But unlike the Allied powers, they didn't look at World War I as the war to end all wars. In a way, they were relishing war. They were relishing war because as fascists, war was in a sense, a cauldron that would, bring out the best in your men and can transform citizens into true ideological soldiers. They also relished war because they hated the Versailles system, and they knew it was going to take violence to overturn it. They also relished war because they had these bigger imperial dreams. So well before World War II began, the Axis belligerents started to imagine future empires in which, essentially the territory of their neighbors were incorporated under their rule. When Hitler talked about a new order in Europe, he was essentially talking not just about assimilating, German-speaking peoples into the German state, but essentially becoming a master of Europe. Mussolini's Third Rome was the idea that he would establish a Third Roman Empire after the Byzantine Empire. Japan talked about an East Asian co-prosperity sphere, or liberating Asians from Western colonialism. In all of these cases, the territory of neighboring states was imagined to belong to them, and in various ways from the 1930s to when the war actually launched on, they were engaged in either diplomacy, building up their armies, aggression, challenging of the League of Nations to bring these empires into being. And what World War II was essentially the unleashing of these Axis armies to follow these preconceived war plans, and the convergence of these separate campaigns into one single conflict that we call World War II. Now, in my view, the feature that makes World War II most unique is what I would call the annihilation discourse. And when Hitler was invading the Soviet Union, he gathered his generals and he said this was not going to be an ordinary war. This was going to be a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. And what he meant is that he was sending the Wehrmacht in not just to beat the Red Army and to take Soviet territory, but their task was to destroy communism and to essentially cleanse the land, almost like Teutonic Knights, to prepare the way for German settlement. So because this was a war of annihilation, he ordered his officers under the Commissar Order to violate the Geneva Conventions, to execute commissars, political officers, ideological communists inside the Russian Red Army, and to execute them on the spot. That was a violation of the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war, and also the Prussian officers, essentially chivalric traditions. But that was really just the tip of the iceberg, because behind the invading Wehrmacht there were these Einsatzgruppen, special detachments whose job it was to round up Jews living in these communities, have them dig improvised pits and shoot them on the spot and bury them in these makeshift graves. In the process of invading Russia, over 1 million Jews were killed in this way. And that was only one dimension of it as well, because in addition to that, with General Plan Ost, the Germans were also engaged in starving to death Russian POWs, Russian civilians, to thin the ranks of the lesser Slavs in order to open up land for German settlers. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of Italian atrocities and Japanese atrocities against the Chinese and other groups, but in many different ways, these ideological ideas of racial Darwinism were infused in the very nature of the war itself. How the Axis powers conducted their war, their visions for empire, and how they targeted civilians deliberately. Not just that civilians were caught in the crossfire, but they were deliberately targeted as lesser people to be exploited, their rights not only to be stripped, but even all the way to the ultimate range of extermination, just exterminating the Jews as a people. So the fact that the Axis powers, launched the war, they in a way determined the nature of the fighting. The fact that they were so successful early in the war and conquered vast empires and brought so many hundreds of millions of Allied civilians under their rule, really dictated the experience of World War II for so many people across the globe. And it was, very, very brutal. One of the things that really characterized World War II and really distinguishes it, in my mind, is that the prototypical casualty was an unarmed civilian. And this was not only, of course, Jews targeted by the Holocaust, but over 20 million Russians and Chinese died in various ways as well as a result of these annihilation ideas driving the war campaigns. And I don't want in any way, somehow draw a moral equivalence, but it's definitely true that the Allied powers responded in kind, or if they didn't respond in kind, they certainly on their own terms violated the rules of war, the Geneva Conventions, when it came to strategic bombing, when it came to unrestricted submarine warfare, many incidents of assassinating POWs rather than taking them prisoner. Maybe the Japanese started the war. They bombed Pearl Harbor without declaring war. They killed American troops in terrible fashion, the Bataan Death March. But did that then justify Hiroshima, which killed many more people than the Bataan Death March? My point is not in a way to ascribe blame or guilt in this way, but just to point out how across the world, whether it was Axis or Allied civilians, it was typically the unarmed civilians that suffered the most. And this meant that the suffering was not only more globally diffuse, but had an impact to the civilian population in a way that really had no historical precedent. So one of the ways we can visualize the destructiveness of World War II is to simply, kind of do the statistics and use deaths as a barometer for it. And when you do that and, kind of divide it up in terms of, country and geography, the first thing you kind of observe is that China and Russia suffered the most casualties, over 20 million each. So that's very significant, when you think about Canada and our memory of World War II and, really focused on, Western Europe, you know, magnitudes more, specifically civilians, but also, of course, military casualties, died outside of the areas that we remember. So that our memory is very unrepresentative of the horrors of this conflict. The country that was most impacted is actually Poland, if you look at it on a per capita basis. This would be 3 million Jews, but there was also 3 million Slavs that lost their lives as well, partly from the fighting, but also from the German ethnic cleansing campaign. Now, among the actual belligerent powers, if you take out Russia, Germany and Japan suffered heavy casualties as well because of Allied bombing, although on an overall scale, their casualties are significantly less because of the Soviet and Chinese figures. I really should talk a little bit more about China's suffering because that's really not on Canadians' radar. And I sometimes call it the hidden Holocaust. It wasn't exactly a Holocaust, but when it came to Manchuria and eastern China, the Japanese troops used anti-partisan tactics in which men, women, and children were killed with such lack of discrimination that it really bordered on genocide, except for the fact that they didn't control all of China and they never imagined that they could exterminate the Chinese as a people. But in a very many ways, the way that they dehumanized the Chinese, abused them, tortured them, killed them, it was very reminiscent of the Holocaust. And the reason I say that is not to, again, to draw parallels. Everyone's suffering was unique, but just to highlight how widely distributed the suffering was, so that you can get a picture of why World War II was such a transformative event. That when the war ended, civilians had suffered and experienced combat in a way just as much as the frontline soldiers, sometimes more. So that if you heard an ambulance pass 10 years later, you might involuntarily wet yourself because it brought you back to the air raid sirens you had been put in as a child. Post-traumatic stress syndrome. The war was in a way enduring for decades later among the survivors. So it's in this that we can, I think, really find the spirit, the idea of, as the inmate at Buchenwald over the Arbeit macht frei sign put in, never again. Never again can we suffer this catastrophe because the horrors, the suffering was unimaginable. So in this module I tried to explain some of the features that made World War II unique. Do you agree with my assessment that World War II represented the worst catastrophe in human history? Certainly, if you would look at number of deaths, World War II would stand out from any previous conflict. Perhaps not on a relative basis, but certainly on an absolute basis. And relative to the features that I described, what do you think was the one element that made the war so horrific, and that propelled civilians with such grim and fierce determination to somehow build a better world of the ashes, so that this catastrophe could not befall them again?